Ever had one of those moments where you think, if I had turned left instead of right that day,
Oh, yeah.
and suddenly your whole life path seems to hinge on, like, that tiny decision? It's a wild thought, isn't it?
It really is.
Well, today we're plunging headfirst into exactly that idea.
That's right. We're taking a deep dive into this concept of flukes, which Brian Klaas explores in his article, The Smallest Moments Have the Largest Impacts.
Yeah, get ready to have your assumptions about how the world works, well, maybe seriously challenged.
Definitely. We're going to unpack just how much randomness and, chaos are really calling the shots, more than we think in our lives and in history.
So forget the neat, tidy cause and effect story we often like to tell ourselves.
Hmm.
We're talking about how the tiniest, most unpredictable things can snowball. Big time.
Huge consequences.
We'll be wrestling with ideas like contingency, dipping our toes into chaos theory.
Yep. And looking at some truly unbelievable personal stories, historical turning points.
And even the philosophy behind it all. It's going to be a fascinating ride, I think.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's start with the core of Klaas's argument. What's the main takeaway?
Essentially, Klaas argues that randomness and those chaotic, unpredictable variables, they play a far, far bigger role in shaping our world than we usually admit.
We prefer the deterministic view, right? Like everything is planned or inevitable.
Exactly. We look for those clear chains of cause and effect. But Klaas says, look, it's often those seemingly insignificant arbitrary moments, the flukes, that are the real drivers of major change.
And he connects this to chaos theory.
He does. He draws on chaos theory, which basically studies these complex systems where even tiny initial variations can lead to massive unforeseen outcomes later on. It hinges on this key concept, sensitivity to initial conditions.
Sensitivity to initial conditions. Okay, and unpack that a bit more for us. What does that mean in practice?
Well, think of it like this. In a really complex, chaotic system, a very, very small change right at the start,
like tiny.
microscopic, potentially, it can result in dramatically different results down the line. That tiny initial nudge can create these huge, unpredictable ripple effects.
Okay, I think I get it.
And this leads us straight to the idea of contingent events. These are seemingly small changes, small events, that carry the potential for just enormous consequences later.
Which sounds a lot like the classic butterfly effect,
Yeah,
right?
precisely. The butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, potentially setting off a tornado in Texas, that whole idea.
It sounds almost, I don't know, mythical when you put it like that.
It does, but it illustrates the core principle. Tiny, seemingly random inputs can lead to massive, unpredictable outputs.
And applying that to our own lives, it's kind of mind-bending. You start thinking, okay, what tiny decision, what chance meeting might have completely altered where I am right now?
Exactly that. Our jobs, who we're with, where we ended up living so much of it, could very well trace back to moments that felt utterly trivial at the time, things we might not even remember.
Right, forgotten moments setting the course.
And Klaus shares a really powerful personal story that drives this point home very starkly.
Yes, the one about his own existence being tied to a really tragic event in his family's past. Can you share that?
It's quite striking. Klaus explains that he's alive today only because his great-grandfather's first wife tragically died by suicide in 1905, along with their 4 young children.
Wow, that's incredibly sad.
It's deeply tragic.
Yeah.
But that devastating, completely unexpected event, a true fluke in the chain of his family history, meant his great-grandfather eventually remarried.
And had more children.
Had more children, starting a new branch of the family tree that ultimately led generations later to Brian Klaas himself being born.
That's a heavy example, but it powerfully illustrates the point. These invisible contingencies, these forks in the road triggered by events completely outside our control.
Shaping our very existence. It's a stark reminder of how deeply our personal histories are woven with chance.
It really makes you pause. You think about your own ancestors, the stories you know, the ones you don't. What unseen events shaped your being here?
Right. And these kinds of pivotal chance occurrences aren't just personal. Klaas argues history is absolutely littered with them.
Yeah, big historical turning points decided by, well, not what you'd expect.
Absolutely. The example he uses of the atomic bombings of Japan during World War II is particularly revealing and quite shocking, actually.
Right. I remember reading about this. It wasn't just a cold, calculated military decision based purely on strategy, was it? There were some incredibly random personal factors involved.
That's putting it mildly. Okay, consider this. Henry Stimson, who was the U.S. Secretary of War at the time,
Okay.
he had this deep personal affection for the city of Kyoto. Why? because he'd vacationed there back in 1926 with his wife.
A vacation
Yep.
from nearly 2 decades earlier.
Yep. He was apparently deeply impressed by its cultural significance, its beauty. And because of this personal feeling, this memory, he intervened twice to take Kyoto off the target list for the atomic bomb.
He overruled the military based on a holiday memory.
He did. He actively prevented it from being bombed,
Hmm.
going against strategic recommendations. So, yeah, a vacation potentially saved an entire city from nuclear annihilation.
That is astonishing. It just doesn't fit the narrative of calculated warfare.
Not at all. And then there's the second bombing, Nagasaki. It wasn't even the primary target that day.
Really? What was?
The intended target was the city of Kokura. But on the day of the bombing run, August 9th, 1945, Kokura was obscured by clouds. Smoke, maybe clouds, poor visibility anyway.
So they couldn't see the target properly.
Exactly. They needed visual confirmation. They flew over a few times, fuel was running low, and the bomber crew had to make a split-second decision. They diverted to their secondary target,
Which was Nagasaki.
which is Nagasaki. So think about the implications. A personal fondness for a city from a vacation years before, and a random patch of bad weather on a specific morning.
Not grand strategy, but nostalgia and a cloud.
Pretty much determined which two Japanese cities faced atomic devastation. It underscores how personal, seemingly irrelevant factors that trip the weather can have these catastrophic geopolitical consequences. It really challenges those neat, rational models of historical decision-making.
It absolutely does. It makes history feel much more fragile, more contingent than the way it's often presented, almost like that movie, Sliding Doors.
That's a perfect analogy Klaas uses, the sliding doors metaphor. It captures perfectly how these tiny, seemingly insignificant moments can create entirely different realities running in parallel.
Just like Gwyneth Paltrow catching or missing that train.
Exactly. And Klaas gives this incredibly powerful real-life example from 9/11 involving a man named Joseph Lott.
Yes, the man who should have been in the World Trade Center that morning. What happened?
He was scheduled to be at a conference giving a presentation high up in one of the towers.
Okay.
But that morning, he made a last-minute decision. He didn't like the shirt he'd put on, so he decided to change it.
Just a simple choice.
And then, the shirt he chose needed ironing. Or maybe it was a tie he decided to wear. A gift that needed pressing. The specific detail isn't the point, but the result was a small delay.
A few extra minutes getting ready.
Exactly. Klaus calls them snooze button moments. Those tiny delays we barely notice. But because of that delay, ironing the shirt or tie, he missed his usual train, arrived later.
And wasn't in the tower when the plane hit?
He survived. Tragically, his colleague, Elaine Greenberg, who was also going to the conference but didn't have those same small delays, she was there, and she perished.
Oh, wow. Snooze button moments, that phrase really sticks with you.
It does. It highlights how these tiny, almost unconscious choices or delays can have these monumental life or death consequences. These critical turning points are often totally invisible until, well, fate reveals their significance.
And it makes you seriously question those comforting phrases people sometimes use, like, everything happens for a reason.
Klaas tackles that head on. He points out why survivors of tragedies like Joseph Lott often find that statement deeply troubling.
Because it implies some kind of plan.
Exactly. It can suggest a predetermined destiny, a sort of cosmic balancing act deciding who lives and who dies. And that adds this really heavy, unnecessary moral weight to events that might just be, well, random, the result of chaotic factors lining up in a certain way.
Right. It takes away the element of sheer terrifying chance and tries to impose a meaning that might not be there, which could feel awful if you're the one who survived when others didn't.
Precisely. So if it's not always for a reason, what does this tell us about causality itself, how things actually happen?
That it's messier than we think.
Much messier,
Mm.
much more chaotic, much less linear. Our brains, they're pattern-making machines. We instinctively create narratives, find order, connect the dots.
It helps us make sense of the world.
It does. It's a survival mechanism, probably. But that instinct can also blind us to the underlying randomness that's constantly at play. Those seemingly invisible variables, Klaas highlights the vacation, the mood, the ironing, the cloud, they aren't exceptions. He argues they're integral parts of how history unfolds.
So it's not just neat chains of A causing B causing C. There are all these other unpredictable inputs constantly nudging things.
Constantly. But, and this is important, acknowledging this randomness doesn't mean throwing our hands up and saying nothing matters.
Right. It doesn't mean we have no responsibility or that it's all just fate. How does Klaas balance that?
Well, he's very clear that recognizing the impact of chance doesn't negate personal responsibility. We still make choices. Our actions still have consequences. We still build things, strive for things.
So it's not an argument for fatalism?
Not at all. It's more like a call for humility. Humility in understanding the forces shaping our lives and the world. It's about recognizing the limits of our control, acknowledging the huge role that luck and chance play alongside our efforts and intentions.
Humility, that's a good way to put it. Understanding we're not always the sole authors of our stories.
Exactly. And interestingly, on the flip side of all this randomness and chaos, he introduces this concept he calls contingent convergence.
Contingent convergence. Okay, that sounds about like a contradiction. Contingent means dependent on chance, right? And convergence means coming together.
It does sound paradoxical, yeah. But it's this really interesting idea that order and randomness aren't mutually exclusive. They can, and often do, coexist within the same systems.
How does that work?
So a small random event, a fluke, can create divergence. It can knock things onto a completely new and unexpected path. That's the contingency part.
Okay, like the chance encounter changing your career.
Exactly. That's the divergence. But within that new trajectory, patterns and order tend to reemerge. That's the convergence. So you change careers because of a fluke meeting.
But then you build routines, skills, connections in the new career. Order develops.
Precisely. Or think about traffic as other example. Individual car accidents are often random, unpredictable events, flukes in a sense. They cause disruption.
Major disruption sometimes.
Right. But despite these random incidents, the overall system of highways, traffic lights, driving rules, that ordered system, means most people still reliably get where they're going most of the time.
So the system has a way of absorbing the randomness and sort of self-correcting towards order.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Systems tend to self-organize, to find stability, even after significant random shocks or disruptions. Contingent events create new paths, but convergence brings structure within those paths.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It paints a picture that's not just pure chaos, but not rigidly determined either. It's like a constant dance between chance and structure.
Exactly, a dynamic interplay. That's what Klaas seems to be getting at.
Well, this has definitely been quite the journey. Really makes you think differently. It's incredible to consider the profound and often totally unseen influence of these flukes on everything. Our lives, history.
It really does push you towards a more, I guess, nuanced and humble view of why things happen the way they do, moving beyond those simple A to B explanations.
Appreciating the complexity, the randomness that's woven into the fabric of it all.
Yeah?
So